The story begins on a quiet February afternoon in 2013, when the city of Philadelphia was bustling like any other weekday. People were going to work, students returning from school, families planning their evenings. Yet somewhere in this familiar routine, tragedy was already unfolding. A family that looked like any other was about to face a night that would not only change their lives forever, but also leave investigators chasing shadows for years to come. It was around 4:30 p.m. when neighbors last saw the young woman walking into her apartment building. She greeted the security guard at the front desk, smiled faintly, and carried her grocery bags upstairs. The day seemed perfectly ordinary. Nothing about her demeanor suggested that something was wrong or that she felt threatened. Yet within hours, everything about that picture of normalcy would vanish. Later that evening, when her family tried to call her, the phone rang endlessly. Text messages went unanswered. At first, they assumed she might have been busy or fallen asleep, but as the hours passed, anxiety started creeping in. By midnight, concern had turned into fear. Her parents drove to her apartment, only to discover something that immediately unsettled them. The lights inside were on. The television was playing softly, but their daughter was nowhere to be found. The front door was locked from the outside, and nothing seemed to be broken or forced. Her phone charger was plugged in by the bed. Her shoes were neatly placed near the entrance, and her purse lay on the couch. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second, but she didn't. When the police were called in, they too were puzzled by the scene. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no cries heard by the neighbors. The building's CCTV showed her entering the lobby earlier that day, but the footage after that point became confusing. At one moment she appeared on the elevator camera, holding her groceries, and then she vanished from the system entirely. No one could say for sure if she ever left the building, and no camera caught her walking out of the main doors. Investigators began to dig deeper. Friends and colleagues were questioned, but no one could provide a concrete lead. She had no known enemies, no suspicious relationships, and her life, by all accounts, was steady and ordinary. The only unsettling detail was that the groceries she had carried up never appeared in her kitchen. They weren't in the trash, weren't in the fridge, and weren't in her apartment at all. It was as if they had disappeared along with her. Days turned into weeks, and the case grew colder. Flyers were plastered across the city, vigils were held, and her story caught the attention of local media. People were baffled at how someone could vanish from inside her own home without leaving a single trace. Some speculated that someone from inside the building must have been involved, given that the entrances were secured, and outsiders would have had difficulty gaining access without being noticed. Others suggested she might have left voluntarily, but her family rejected that idea firmly, pointing to her unfinished assignments, unpaid bills, and personal belongings left behind. The apartment itself became an eerie symbol of the mystery. Everything was frozen in time, the bed unmade, the coffee mug half empty on the table, the television remote placed neatly on the couch armrest. It looked as though she would walk back through the door at any moment and pick up where she left off. But she never did, and the silence inside those walls grew heavier with each passing day. Even more chilling was the timeline. Investigators reconstructed her last movements with painstaking care, but every lead collapsed into contradictions. Some neighbors claimed they heard faint noises from her apartment that evening, but none could recall anything unusual or alarming. The building staff insisted no strangers entered that night. Friends confirmed she had made plans for the next day, and she seemed excited about them. It made no sense for her to simply vanish. The case baffled not just the detectives assigned to it, but also seasoned criminologists who later studied it. Disappearances often leave at least a fragment of evidence: a broken lock, a witness account, a piece of abandoned clothing. But here, there was nothing. It was as though she had been erased from her own life, leaving behind a perfect still frame of her existence. By the end of the first month, the investigation hit a wall. Leads had dried up, media attention had begun to fade, and the family was left with more questions than answers. Every time they visited the apartment, they described it as walking into a ghost story. Her scent lingered on the clothes, her handwriting was on the notes by the fridge, her laughter echoed in their memories, but she herself was gone. That chilling contrast between presence and absence, the locked door, the untouched belongings, the missing groceries, turned this case into one of the most haunting urban mysteries in recent history. To this day, many people still whisper about it, of the girl who went missing in her own apartment, a phrase that perfectly captures both the impossibility and the terror of what happened that night. But even with all this attention, the central mystery refused to fade. Who was responsible for the murders? And why did they happen in such a small, quiet town? Many pointed to Frank F. Jones, a wealthy state senator and prominent businessman from Villisca. Josiah Moore had once worked for Jones, but after a bitter falling out, Moore opened his own successful store and took some of Jones's best clients with him. This created years of resentment, and locals whispered that Jones might have had the means and motive to hire someone to eliminate his rival. However, there was never any concrete evidence linking him to the crime, only speculation that has survived for generations. Another name that often surfaces in connection with the case is William Blackie Mansfield. He was a suspected serial killer believed to have committed axe murders in several different states around the same time period. Mansfield allegedly killed his wife, in-laws, and infant child just 2 years after the Villisca murders. Some investigators suggested that his crimes bore eerie similarities to the Moore case. In fact, private detectives even claimed that Mansfield could be placed near Villisca on the night of the murders. But like so many leads in this case, nothing was proven beyond doubt. Then there was Reverend George Kelly, perhaps the most infamous suspect of all. Kelly was a traveling preacher who had arrived in Villisca the day before the murders to participate in the church service the Moore family attended that Sunday night. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed nervous and unsettled, and strangely fascinated with the case afterward. He even wrote lengthy letters to investigators and confessed multiple times to the killings, but his confessions were inconsistent and often bizarre, leading many to believe he was mentally unstable. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted, and the case against him fell apart. The frustrating reality that no suspect was ever convicted, leaving the Villisca axe murders as one of America's greatest unsolved crimes. For more than a century, researchers, historians, and true crime enthusiasts have tried to untangle the web of rumors, theories, and half-truths surrounding that fateful night. Some believe it was the work of a transient killer, passing through town and leaving death in his wake. Others think it had to be someone close to the family, someone who knew the layout of the house and the habits of the victims. What adds to the chilling nature of this case is how the killer appeared to take their time inside the home. After murdering the family, the intruder covered mirrors with cloth, draped clothing over windows, and even prepared food in the kitchen, but never ate it. These details suggest not just brutality, but ritualistic behavior, as if the murders were part of some disturbing obsession or compulsion. It's this unnerving combination of savagery and ritual that keeps the story alive more than a century later. Today, the Villisca Axe Murder House has become a destination for both tourists and paranormal investigators. Preserved to look as it did in 1912, the small white home stands as a grim reminder of that terrible night. Visitors report strange occurrences inside, footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening on their own, children's laughter echoing through the halls. For many, the house is not just a historic site, but a place still haunted by the spirits of the Moore family and their guests. Over the years, countless documentaries, books, and podcasts have dissected the Villisca murders, but the case remains officially unsolved. Each new theory seems to only deepen the mystery rather than solve it. What is certain, however, is the profound impact the murders left on the town itself. Villisca never fully recovered from the horror of that night. Trust among neighbors was shattered, families grew suspicious of one another, and the once peaceful community became a place defined by whispers and shadows. The tragedy of Wielicka is not just the loss of 8 lives, but the enduring absence of justice. A century later, we can only imagine what the Moore family and their young guests endured in those final, terrifying moments. The unanswered questions leave an unsettling emptiness that no amount of research or speculation can ever truly fill. Perhaps that is why the Wielicka axe murders continue to captivate us to this day, because they remind us of the darkness that can hide in the most ordinary of places, waiting silently, just beyond the glow of the lamplight. The months that followed were filled with uncertainty and fear. Police searched tirelessly, following up on tips from across the state, but most of them led nowhere. Each passing day without answers deepened the mystery. Journalists swarmed the town, cameras flashing, microphones extended, and soon the case wasn't just local news, it was a national story. People across the country began speculating, trying to piece together what might have happened. Was this the work of someone close to her, or a stranger who had been stalking her movements? Friends recalled how vibrant she had been, always smiling, always full of life. For her family, each interview with detectives was like reopening a wound that never closed. They were asked the same questions again and again, and though they wanted nothing more than to help, their own memories started to blur under the weight of constant suspicion. Rumors began to spread, some pointing fingers at people in her inner circle, others suggesting random drifters who had passed through town. The lack of concrete evidence created a breeding ground for speculation, and soon the lines between fact and fiction became almost impossible to separate. Detectives discovered that on the night she disappeared, there were several unconfirmed sightings. Some claimed they saw her walking near a gas station. Others believed she might have been picked up by a car, but with no cameras and no physical evidence. These accounts were nothing more than ghost trails. Even so, police chased each lead with desperation, knowing that one detail, however small, could unlock the truth. Her disappearance struck fear into young women everywhere. Parents warned their daughters not to go out alone at night. Bars and college campuses tightened security, and the community began hosting vigils to keep her name alive. Each vigil was both a reminder of the hope that she might still be found and a painful acknowledgement of the darkness that hung over everyone. Candles flickered, prayers were whispered, and her photograph stared back from posters taped on every telephone pole and storefront. What made the case even more frustrating was the sudden lack of communication. Police released only vague updates, fueling frustration among the public. Conspiracy theories began filling the silence. Some believed she had staged her own disappearance to escape personal troubles. Others were convinced foul play was involved, perhaps from someone she trusted. The internet only magnified these theories, with online forums dissecting every detail, every rumor, and every timeline inconsistency. As the investigation stretched into months, detectives began re-examining earlier evidence, hoping to find something they had overlooked. They scrutinized her phone records, credit card transactions, and even her social media activity. Strangely, everything had gone silent after the night she vanished. There was no activity, no calls, no messages. It was as if she had been erased from the map in a single moment. The weight of the case fell heavily on the lead detective, who admitted years later that it was one of the most haunting investigations of his career. He described sleepless nights, stacks of files filling his desk, and the endless feeling of chasing shadows. With every false lead, hope seemed to slip further away. Yet, he and his team refused to give up, determined to find closure for a family living in constant agony.